there's been a lot of. It's interesting that I popped on now because you guys were talking a lot about the your Dutch background and how it interacts with your relationship with the church. I'm of Chinese background. I was born in America, um, but my forefathers, as it were, are from China. Um, and I grew up. I spent the first maybe 5 6 years of my life in a Chinese independent Chinese church. Then ended up moving to an American, well, called an American church. That's really non-specific, but not Chinese church. To make it less specific. And I'm interested. It's so fascinating to see how you guys' backgrounds uh, interact with the church because the CRC is necessary or kind of by nature a an ethnic church, although it kind of isn't exactly that way now. Um, and so, as somebody who's not only no longer going to a church that's tied with their home culture, um, but China as a country has a really complicated relationship with Christianity. It's never been a Christian nation. Um, like the closest we get is like there's a huge movement of Nestorian Christians back in the seventh century, um, and we have remnants of that. And then it's not till like maybe the 17th century or the 17th and 18th century that we really get any more Christians, and then that's mainly Christians from the Western Church, Catholics and Protestants, which is interesting. So uh, I'm trying to cohere this into a whole pitch, but it's mainly I'm asking about like, okay, how do you, and this might not be relevant at all, how do you, as somebody whose background is intrinsically tied to Christianity just by historical standards, how do you think people who are of a background who is not in any way tied to Christianity, well, very little tied to Christianity, should approach Christianity now? Like, should the whole should China submit to the Catholics or the Orthodox, or maybe they should submit to the Baptist Church, or all become Presbyterian? Like, what a strange, or they'll all become Lutherans. You know, it's a very strange kind of, or maybe they should all form their own national church, like they kind of already have. I guess it kind of ties into the whole like we are talking about Chinese bishops a lot during the Pope talks, um, stuff like that. I don't know. That's that. I hope that kind of is coherent enough to counter the pitch.
That is very coherent. That was excellent, Caleb. That was excellent, and to me, much more engaging than banjo talk. Although if that's what wins the votes, we'll talk about banjos.
I will play the banjo for you later if you still request.
Whoa!
We'll have a banjo off with Jason.
Well, you know, if y'all make some music videos in the corner, I will steal them and use them for branding. So if you do make a banjo video, let me know, and I'll, I like playing the branding. I was 15 minutes before the start. It's like, should I start branding now? Nah, people complain there's too much branding. And then I got distracted by something. It was 5 minutes, like, oh, not enough branding. But here we are. Daniel, introduce yourself. How did you? I also put out a link because there wasn't a lot of uptake very quickly on this week's, and so I actually put out a link on CRC Voices, and with a last name like that, and again, most people are like, last name like what? No, we Dutchmen, we've got. Let's see, it's Radar, Gaydar. I don't know the Dutch version of Gaydar, but Dutch we got Dar. It. Yeah. What's that?
Dutch Dar.
Dutch Dar? I don't know. Hollendar. There, that's good. Hollendar.
You're offending my Friese.
I know you're Frisian, but we accept you in America.
Yeah, my grandma was Frisian, so
my whole mom's side is Frisian. Yeah. We just got to keep Verdonk. We were in the Netherlands for a meeting of estuary. We had a lovely big group of people sitting in a circle, all going to have some sweet communal estuary vibes. And John Verdonk says the most offensive thing about the Frisians right there in the middle. And it was like, 1/3 of the group is suddenly upset. I'm like, Verdonk, what are you doing?
Did he say they're not stubborn?
Let's not start. Daniel, introduce yourself.
Hey everybody. So my name is Daniel Dreistra. I was born and raised here in beautiful Abbotsford, British Columbia. Yep. So Canadian. So double whammy. Very Dutch, very Canadian. And I just graduated from Dort last May. So I don't know if there's any other Dort people in this in the corner, but I'm sure there's a few.
There are a few.
A few here and there. So Dort is kind of adjacent to Calvin. Different, but adjacent to Calvin. So I spent 4 years in Northwest Iowa, and then I spent 6 months actually living in Hawaii, working for a farm there. And then I've been back home since my dad got sick last November. So I've been home since then. And I've been a part of the corner, a long time lurker, probably like 4 or 5 years. I've watched you, Paul. I've never really interacted. I've never, never taken this step, but I had a Friday, I had an opportunity today. And I was like, and then you sent the email out. I've been gifted subs, I guess, gifted memberships. I don't know exactly how this all works. So I was gifted membership, and then you sent me the email, and I was like, oh, okay. I have free time. So let's try and make this next step into participation, I guess.
All right.
So
Speaking
that's
of
kind of my story.
All right. Speaking of gifted memberships, I just dropped 5. Google lets me gift 10 a month just free. So I just dropped 5 more into the, for all of you cheapskates out there that don't really want to cough up $3 a month for a membership. You don't get a lot for it, but you do get access to this link on, 2 or 3 times a month, probably. So there you go. There's 5 free memberships for all of you Frisians out there and Dutchmen that know how to pinch a penny. Okay, Daniel, you know how the estuary works?
Not somewhat, not really.
Okay. Well, it's your turn to pitch an idea to the group. It can be something intellectual, it can be something contextual, it can be something personal, or it can be something estuarial. So choose.
I suppose I've been kind of in these last few months interested in Jordan Hall and his conversion and his kind of thesis for solving the meta crisis. And he seems to have proposed that the solution is a local church, a healthy local church, essentially, and then all things rise up from that. I think that's probably fair to say. And I find it, I'm 22 and I live in one of the most expensive parts of the entire world, up here in BC, close to Vancouver. And I find it a little bit convenient for him, who is very successful and has earned his way and can afford a home, to put that forward as a solution. When I look around and I think, man, the simple reality is that my parents have had a higher quality of life than I probably will have at the same age, just based on our situation and where I am at. And so I just wonder if we need to do more, I suppose, to the jump to post-liberal society has real casualties, I suppose. And so I'm just opening it up to that somehow.
So to try and break back into things a little bit, part of the reason why it's been on my mind recently, let's start there, is because I recently moved to a new area, and there's a part of, and it's closer to my family now. I moved recently from Indiana, in a place that's like 90% white people, and like 7% Hispanics and like 3% Black people. You can probably count as many Chinese, and then there is me. No, it's funny. I used to joke that probably the only other Chinese people you'd see in town are in the local Chinese restaurant. But now that I moved back,
every town has a Chinese restaurant.
Yeah,
and that's not just in the U.S. It's all over the world.
That's right. Our greatest cultural export. Even though there's a certain degree to which some of that stuff has no resemblance to actual Chinese food. But that's neither here nor there. It's still pretty delicious most of the time. So now that I moved back up here, where there is not a like huge Chinese population, but there is one. I've recently, so when I was down in Indiana, I actually attended for the first time. Like, I grew up relatively low church, and then for the first time, I attended a an Anglican church of the Reformed Episcopal Church variety, um, and that kind of blew my socks off a little bit because I've been for years I've been kind of reading about historic Christianity and reading some of the earlier Christian writers like Saint Augustine, Saint Athanasius. Thanks to C.S. Lewis, who is in no small part a huge contributor to my Christian life, as I'm sure he is to many. And um, and so now I'm like, oh, okay, well, um, I'd like to go now that I'm in an area now that I can no longer go to there's no Anglican church like it in the area that I moved to. So now I'm like, okay, well, now that I think about it, what kind of church do I want to go to? And so I was thinking, oh, okay, well, the Lutherans are an easy kind of like I hate to call it second highest church in Protestantism, but they're of a similar bent, let's say. So I was thinking, oh, okay, let's do that. But I've been like floating around various churches, not all high church. I've been to a couple of non-denominational just for the heck of it. I was thinking of attending an African American church too. It's just to see. Never been to one. Uh, but um, but I was thinking to myself, and I've met a couple of a couple of missionaries. I've been back to my childhood church, which is kind of falling apart. That's a whole other issue. And I've been thinking about it's like, okay, we have all these churches that have their roots in Germany and in Switzerland and the Netherlands, obviously. All kinds of places in Europe. The Roman Church, I guess, is based in Rome. Uh, and also, I've also been attending I've been to a couple of Eastern Orthodox services, which are based in their various Russian and whatever. I keep wanting to say Constantinopolitan roots, but whatever. I think that's I don't know if that quite works. Um, Various roots, Greek roots, we'll call it that. And I've been sitting here thinking, okay, and then there's always the option for me to go back to a Chinese church of its various sorts. I've also been to a Korean church for some reason. That was weird. And so I've been thinking to myself, it's like, okay, I really like the liturgy that you have in the more traditional churches, but those are the traditional European churches. If I went to a church that was more, let's say, ethnically have more ethnic ties to, um, I would necessarily have to go to either. Well, actually, I was gonna say I necessarily have to go to to a more of like a closer to a non-denominational, maybe Baptist-ish kind of church. Um, with the I was about to say that, and I was stopping myself saying because there is like technically Chinese Catholic churches out there. There just isn't any around me. There's a Korean Catholic church and not a Chinese Catholic church. There must be a lot of Koreans around now that I think about it. Anyways, so I've been thinking about it. It's like, okay, to what degree am I supposed to be submitting to the I won't call it necessarily the Western traditions because I've been to Eastern Orthodox Church, but to a certain degree, to everything is West besides compared to China, uh, except for Japan and Korea, I guess. But that's uh, so it's like, okay, do I necessarily have to submit to the Western traditions if I want to have like a more traditional style church, which kind of makes sense. It's like, okay, China didn't have Christian. I know somebody in the chat. I can't remember. Might have been Matt mentioned that. Okay, the Nestorian churches continue to exist since the 7th century, but I feel like there hasn't been a distinctly Chinese flavor of Christianity like you have distinctly German, distinctly Dutch, distinctly Roman, um, uh, and various other, or even this again distinctly, as it were, Greek or distinctly. Uh, Russian or Syrian type churches. And so it's like, okay, is it? I mean, it's awful to say, but there's a part of me that thinks, am I betraying a certain part of myself if I submit to these more European traditions? Am I betraying the part of myself that is Chinese? Now, that's as to whether that's betrayable for the sake of Christ. Obviously, it should be. Obviously, my identity as a Chinese descendant, Chinese by descent, should take subordination to my identity as a Christian. But shouldn't, if everybody else has their kind of like, you have your not allegiances, affiliations, affections, relation to your Dutch background, even through your church, should I not also work to have an affiliation to my Chinese background through my version of church? And I've had people say it's like, oh yeah, um, Christianity is like a Western religion because it's like, and there's from the first Chinese perspective, that's kind of just true.
But
even though I think it's
Western
broader
from a Chinese perspective. Indians,
yeah, pretty much.
Western. But what's interesting is that I wonder to what degree the independent Church of China that has, sort of been against the government, sort of grew up. So what happened in the world during the colonial period is that the colonial powers sent out missionaries that were often wedded with government power. So Anglican churches, Roman Catholic churches, these colonial powers seeded churches into other lands. And then what happened in sort of the post-colonial period is that there was often a severing, and then so-called indigenous churches would spring up. That's happening in Africa, that's happening in Asia, and it's been happening in China because you have sanctioned churches and unsanctioned churches. The question will come, whereas in China, the colonial suppression isn't coming from England or Spain or France or one of those European far off countries. The colonial suppression is coming from the Chinese communist government. When Chinese communism finally sort of collapses, which may mean, again, the breakup of China, which is a perennial issue in China, it could be then that at that point, a much more indigenous Chinese Christianity emerges, as we've seen the emergence of certain African strains of Christianity, that your question will get answered. But for now, I think your question's a great one.
Yeah, it's a great one in the sense of it seems insurmountable.
Well, but the Christian Reformed Church, as I've talked about in the channel, has been wrestling with this for years, because in 1980, I've posted the cover of Andy Kuyvenhoven's banner article about burning the wooden shoes. In the civil rights movement in America, there was a self-conscious effort in the Christian Reformed Church to get rid of Dutch culture and indigenize. And I know Canadian Dutch immigration was interesting because the Dutch Canadian immigration happened after the Second World War, and many Dutch immigrants went to Canada and self-consciously very quickly attempted to indigenize. The post-World War II immigrant waves in the Christian Reformed Church came to America and Canada and said, we're Americans, we're Canadians, we're not Dutch. The 19th century immigrants came to America. They didn't go to Canada. They came to America and said, we're Dutch and we're going to hold on to our Dutchness as long as possible. And so there's so many layers in what you're talking about, Caleb.
Yeah, just as an example, I'll jump in, sorry. But yeah, all four of my parents are from Holland, or my grandparents. They're all from the homeland. And a couple of my uncles and aunts are actually directly from Holland as well. But I speak no Dutch. And my parents that were not born in Holland speak no Dutch, even though some of their siblings do. So,
and that's common in the CRC now.
But if you go to Orange City, Iowa, where everybody immigrated in 1850, they still have the Tula Festival every year, where they dress up in the costumes and they have the wooden shoes. So,
and Jason and Ron smile because Granville and Hudsonville, with the much depleted muck farms, is right next to Holland, Michigan, where they have the mother of all tulip festivals and a wooden shoe factory that Christian Reformed people would make pilgrimages to.
The holy city.
Yeah,
But I think that the
I've done some
issue,
clomping dancing. Not ashamed to admit it.
All right, Jason Kloppen. Go ahead, Ron.
you guys know all this stuff about the West Michigan Dutch culture that I don't even know about. Even I got to catch up. But what I hear us talking about is, what does it mean to be in the world but not of it? Like, to what extent are we citizens of part of this world, or to what extent are we? We talk about having our allegiances in this world as being a secondary allegiance after followers of Christ. But I know I grew up assuming that being a follower of Christ meant being like we all were. And that meant being white, being Midwestern, suburbanite, meaning Dutch. And I've now realized I've just moved back to West Michigan after most of my adulthood being away in different places. And yeah, that I can't tie my identity very much at all to an ethnicity, whether it's Dutch American, whether it's Chinese American, or anything else. That's not where our identity comes from, but obviously that's a force that shapes us. And so, as followers of Christ, what does it mean to be genuinely in our world or our worlds, but not actually be of them?
One of the things I thought about when you were talking about the church in China, Caleb, and then Paul, you brought up that the oppression is internal, not external, within the culture, and that was the state of Christianity for better part of its first 300 years. It was alienated from the levers of power within the empire by a great empire. And when it was liberated, ultimately, it exploded with all this energy had built up and thought and organization. And really, it didn't stop Christianity from just deepening. It just then bloomed. It took over the empire very quickly once Constantine took the lid off. But what I would fear for Chinese Christianity, I'm very interested in what Chinese Christianity and what Indian Christianity and what African Christianity is going to bring to us, because we need to be saved. I think Western Christianity is a catastrophe. I would say American, and this is after doing a deep study. I'm neck deep in a study of the history of evangelicalism in America, and it is an all-out. I called my own church a shit show. It is the grander shit show, presiding over all the little shit shows spread across this continent. And I mean this very specifically, and in a way that the Chinese Christianity, Eastern Christianity, could actually fix us. That is not Eastern Orthodox, but a new Eastern Christianity out of the cultures of India and China, is that evangelicalism in America after the American Revolution began as an individualistic reaction to authority. The Second Great Awakening, Arminianism against Calvinism, boom, sweeps across. Then we get, and with each subsequent awakening, Second Great Awakening, Azusa Street in 1906, Jesus People, it's individualism doubling down again and again and again. More individual, more internal, more about me, more performative, right? And then we have just recently the Asbury revival, which took place just an hour's drive from Cane Ridge in Kentucky.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yes, that's close. Named after The university is named after Francis Asbury, the man who basically stayed during the revolution and solidified Methodism in America. They say he's more responsible than Wesley for making Methodism great in America.
Really?
Yes, and by the early 19th century, it was the largest Protestant denomination within the United States. It was powerful, but it shaped everything that came after it.
Yeah.
And that revival culture, what you have then in Asbury, it's so individualistic.
Yeah.
Go to the testimonies online. It's bone chilling when you stop to think about it, because they have all this mystical, wonderful music behind it in the background, all these interviews. And we're all supposed to be heartwarmed by these young people who have these deeply internal, deeply individualistic experiences. And they're very proud, very, very proud of the fact that there's no preachers. This is unorchestrated. This is unplanned. As soon as somebody older stands up to preach, the spirit left the room. But when a young person, a Zoomer, it's like a cultural revolution within evangelicalism in this moment for 2 weeks.
Oh, it's like the Jesus people. I mean, that was the same thing with the Jesus
same
people.
thing, only more so. There's not even a Lonnie Frisbee at Asbury, right? There's no standout personality, theology, teaching whatsoever. It is all it's we got internal healing. We're deeply wounded. They're deeply traumatized by COVID, the lockdowns, the disruption to their lives, the grooming that's been going on with the algorithms through social media that's been taking place on their consciousness. This is just like what all the other revivals, a traumatized population suddenly finding healing in this revival experience, but it's more individualistic than ever. And what I was hoping for a Chinese Pope. And
you got an American one.
But we got an American. I'm the only American who's disappointed we got an American Pope. I really hope that something very new and different will come along and break us out of this 200-year dream of I'm one person by myself in the world.
All right. Wow. Jason, Daniel, Ron, we've had some big takes from Mark and Caleb here.
I can say a little bit about that. I think Mark's expressing a kind of ennui for some traditionalism and some authority and some guidance in the world, rather than just the nurturing of this inner sacred self. And I think that's directly related to what Caleb's asking about. My identity as a descendant of Chinese, my identity as a Christian, and how do those interact? And as I look at it, it was such a, it was so much the air that I breathed as a child that I don't think I could properly distinguish between when is a situation calling forth my Dutch identity and when is it calling forth Christianity. And how I know those things are different. And there was a real sense that everyone believed these Christian truths. And that was the thing that we didn't ever want you to walk away from. But the Dutch thing was there too. Maybe the Dutch was a bit more familial kind of valence to it, but there was a real sense of we're spending money to send you to a Christian school, bub, because we want you to understand everything through this lens. I don't want you to get lost in that world out there. And I found as I've left that area and come out here to Phoenix, I've had a deep ennui for that. And I look at my generation of Generation X, my friend group, I might be the only one who's still Christian, much less Reformed. And I'm like, what have we lost? What did we walk away from? I look at my grandpa and my grandma, and I'm just like, what did we lose? We were so snotty. And it's kind of terrifying in some sense. But is it the Dutchness? how is it's not the Dutchness, but how is the Dutchness related to the Christianity? Because it was somehow, and in some ways contradictory ways, because we did want to reach out to everybody. We did see Christianity as something that we wanted to share with the world, but we wanted to stay Dutch too. There was things in conflict with it, you know. I don't know, but I feel it more than I think it. I'll just say that. Like I feel, and I feel a little bit of what Daniel's talking about as well. With I can't afford to live somewhere and settle down and find a church. Like, yeah, what did my grandparents have and my parents that we just don't now?
I hear that. I hear that in Chad's, because when I look at the passion at which many in our circles in the TLC have embraced orthodoxy now, and many of those who have embraced it are sort of generic American individualists. And so now, sort of with orthodoxy, you can get the whole package. And so you're going to go to an Orthodox church, it's going to be in Romanian, but you don't care. So I went to I was at a service in Ireland with Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw and Christian Baxter, and stood through a mostly Romanian service in Galway, Ireland. And to me, it was like, but obviously some of the others were there, and they're like, okay, so then it's like, well, what part of this is the desire to get deeply rooted in an ethne that has land?
But can you
Paul, real quick.
as an individual who's in this consumeristic culture searching for something, can you obtain it that way, or do you have to be born in it the way it's just in every fiber of my being?
Yeah.
I can't escape laughing about mine.
Yeah.
Right.
Good. Mark, you want to be real quick? Then I want to hear from Daniel.
Yeah, really, really fast. After trashing evangelicalism, I think it's really important for me to point out that its virtue is that, particularly of the more charismatic it is, the more experience driven it is, its power with people who can't make that steep intellectual climb into orthodoxy or even high church, whether it's Catholicism or something. They just, it's too much for them. There's a directness to the experience, to the Billy Graham message, and that's its power. And there's just, somehow the people who venture off into the heady waters of orthodoxy, and they need to remember to bring it back. If they just go there to be self-satisfied and to enrich their own spiritual life, I think they've missed the calling. It's to find it and then bring it back, particularly for people who have an evangelical background, so that we've got to qualitatively deepen the evangelical experience as a church, as a community, as churches.
All right, Daniel,
thoughts?
I have a few thoughts. I'm going to try and put them together here. I don't know how well it's going to go, but I know that personally, like my grandparents both moved away from their homes. So my grandma, her family, they immigrated to Terrace, and then she moved here to Abbotsford. My grandpa, he immigrated to Bowmanville, Ontario, and then immigrated to Abbotsford after they got married. And so they left home, first from Holland and then from within Canada. But now all my uncles and aunts live here, and the family ties are very strong. We have a very strong family ties. And then my parents, they said, hey, go out into the world and, get educated, go work somewhere else. So I did that. I went to Dort in Northwest Iowa, and then I went to Hawaii for 6 months and worked there. And so I did the thing, I left home, I crossed the threshold, whatever you want to call it. And there was never pressure to come home, even though I always knew that my mom would like it if I came home. Of course, right? There was never pressure. There really wasn't.
You just know.
You just know, right? And then my dad got sick last November, and I got on a plane and I came home, and it was like that was the thing to do, and those family ties are integral to the Christian experience, I think. Like as much as you can develop them, it's easier if they're blood, but if you can develop them, in the spiritual sense as well, that's essential to the Christian experience, I think. For me, that meant, sacrificing Maui for, the British Columbia and the rainy weather that we have here and the impossible housing market. And we're going to figure it out, but I'm committed to home. This is home. And my church that I grew up in is my church, and I'm going to stay here. And I'm kind of going to reject the advice of my parents a little bit, and they're of course okay with that. And they're happy to have me back, and I'm happy to be back. I'm finding it's not so bad, actually. It's actually quite good. And the connection to church and to home and to my family members and my friends here from high school and elementary school it runs really deep. And it just wasn't there when I was away. And so yeah, it feels like a genuine home, and I feel blessed to be home, I guess, even though the circumstances are not ideal. So yeah, I don't know, like Mark, you kind of talking about the evangelical church and the culture that, the boomer mentality, I think, was like, go get a job in Houston, and then that's where you make money, and the houses are cheap. So go there. That's where the good life is a little bit. And in America, everybody moves for work. Everybody does, right? They move for work. And I'm like sitting here like, not worth it. We're gonna figure it out here.
But you're also looking at the price of housing as Abbotsford. I mean, you mentioned that as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We're gonna work through it.
Because it used to be in the CRC. So both Ron and I come from ministerial households, and in the CRC, the ministerial household moved between colonies.
Yep. Yeah, there's four churches here plus the Chinese church. So first, second, third, fourth, fifth.
There you go, Caleb. You can have a choice. You can do Chinese or Dutch if you go to Abbotsford. Ron, what are your thoughts on this, Ron?
There's a quote that I heard, and I can't think of where it's from, but somebody said God has no grandchildren. And the point of the quote is, it's talking about individuals, but the point is, if you have mom and dad are children of God, mom and dad have a child, say one of us, that child is not God's grandchild. And what God wants is for his children's child to come up alongside the parents spiritually so they can all be God's children. And the point that this writer had was that there's got to be some kind of breaking away and rebellion against the structures, the channels through which his experience of God as his own childhood came from. Otherwise, that person is simply inheriting one's faith via mom and dad rather than having it from a personal connection to God through a personal relationship. I think the same thing applies not only to individuals, but also to groups or to denominations or Christian subcultures. And on the one hand, I hear us all talking about dissonance that we have with various Christian cultures or Christian traditions, and that's painful and disorienting. At the same time, it strikes me as it's probably a really healthy thing, because what's really important is that 20 years from now, each of us are part of some kind of Christian community that has a personal firsthand connection to God through Jesus Christ, rather than, even if that comes at the expense of the form that took, say, a generation prior to us. And so on the one hand, there's dissonance in what I hear us talking about. On the other hand, I see that as an important part of grandchildren, children of God's children, finding their own place in God's family.
Isn't that the function of confession of faith?
Part of it, yeah.
For you to break away from your parents and say, this is the, in a Calvinist tradition, to say, this is me saying, I believe this stuff.
Yeah. Now, in my own case, my parents always made a point of, don't do this because my dad's a pastor, like Paul said. Don't do this because your dad's a minister, or don't do this because, certainly not because you're Dutch. They do it because you're a Christian. And so I think they said and intended all the right things. On the other hand, I think my brothers and I kind of knew what the straight and narrow was, and this was the path to tread on. And I didn't really start to rethink that until my kids were old enough to start having some of these conversations.
This is so interesting to me. Phlebas has noted sort of the generational divide. Now, Mark, of course, part of what I see happening is, and I love how Chad's pitch sort of really cemented this, because what I hear from Chad is that, okay, we saw the meaning crisis, so we have the TLC, and so Chad, he before he got here, Chad had achieved sobriety or been gifted sobriety, but after the Peterson pipeline, Chad goes to a Lutheran church, and he's embedded in the Lutheran church, and he has a child and a wife. But after the video, I'll probably play Chad's poem again, which is just this haunting poem, which is really, I think, has everything to do with children feeling abandoned by their parents. There's yet another thing coming out now about what divorce has done to an entire generation of population. And I think there's that element. Then there's also sort of immigration. Immigration is sort of a multi-generational divorce where you lose your roots. And part of, I think, the real pushback against the Enlightenment has been, Mark's cry that he made here about the promise of Enlightenment and the promise of, let's say, the nanny state is that you don't have to have children to not starve in old age. You can have Social Security. You don't have to kowtow to dad's demand that you take over the family business. You can go to university, get an education, and work when and wherever you want to. And so part of what we had, and of course this came to fever pitch in the 60s with the counterculture against the man. It's promising a rootless condition. And who is that globalist who said, you will own nothing and be happy? Which also sort of said, you will be owned by nothing. And so there's this sense of alienation that I hear underneath. And on one hand, you've the Christianity that sort of comes through Methodism. And it's very interesting because before Ron and I, the great threat of our grandparents' generation, Ron, in the Christian Reformed Church was Methodism. Well, the Christian Reformed Church has to stay away from Methodism. And so then we're going to emphasize the canons of Dort because Methodism is the enemy. But that shift that happens in the Christian Reformed Church from the first wave of immigration before the First World War, and then the after second wave immigration, which comes, even though both groups of immigrants were looking for economic stability. The first immigration wave came and said, we're going to plant New Netherlands here in America. And so Van Raalte names the city he founds what? Holland and Graafschap and Borculo. And West Michigan is just populated with town names from the Netherlands. That generation came and said, we're going to plant America. We're going to plant the Netherlands in a new world, just like they did in the early colonial period. The post-World War II immigrants come and say, we're not even going to teach our kids Dutch. We're going to be Canadians. We're going to be Americans. We're going to move to where the jobs are. And that, Phlebas is noting, Phlebas, again, someone from the CRC, he's noting that, yeah, these boomers, these people were all raised by the second wave of, they're more than happy to burn the wooden shoes. Wooden shoes, what are they? Never worn a pair. Sorry. I'll wear Nikes. So, but I think, Caleb, you had the insight to say, hey, wait a minute. That thing that's going on with you Dutch people, that's been going on for a very long time with the Chinese.
Oh yeah. No, it was wonderful to hear your talks. Like I still go back sometimes to you talking about like whenever you talk about the whole burning Dutch shoe, burning the wooden shoes thing, because it really speaks to like, I mean, to be fair, I think the Chinese dynamic is a little bit different because it is kind of ongoing. There's still even I don't know the numbers on the rate of immigration, but I think it might be increasing over time. I don't know if that's the way it worked for the Dutch immigrants.
The Dutch had two waves, but they stopped when the Netherlands basically got their feet under them. And then a neighbor moved in behind me next door, came to the States. His wife had lived in the Netherlands a while. I remember talking to him, and he was like, "You're a Dutch Reformed minister? I hate ministers. Ministers are everything that's wrong in the world." And he and his wife, they then wanted to rent the church because they wanted to do some new age things. And it's like, I don't think my council is going to sanction that in the church. But, and part of the Dutch immigration was the Dutchmen who came over after the war. They had the opportunity to go back and visit, which the old ones never had the chance to do because it was just too expensive. They would go back to the Netherlands, and all we would hear was, what's happened to the Netherlands? We can't let that happen to us. Oh, yeah.
No, it's such an interesting dynamic, and again, it's a lot to do with this move away. I guess you talked a lot about, and I've seen Europe's moving away from European countries moving away from Christianity over time, even though they are the traditionally Christian countries. So it's. I mean, Mark mentioned, you have the African and Indian churches and the Chinese church, etc., which are actually in some measure growing quite a lot. Well, technically, India and Africa have more historically Christian roots because you have the Thomas Church, the church that Thomas founded, and then you have the Ethiopian Church and the various offshoots of that. Or I shouldn't say offshoots. You know what I mean? Other Christian churches that are over there.
Keep going. We've all watched Universal History. At least some of us have.
I'm still waiting for Richard Rowland's China episode. It's going to happen one of these days. I hope. Well, maybe not, actually. I hope he does it. Let's say that. I hope you forgive me if I have a chance to talk. I've been kind of taking in everybody's kind of views, whatever you want to call them. One thing, so I know, so Ron's point that he makes is like, okay, you should be Christian primarily, regardless if that conflicts with your culture. Good, to take Christianity. If it doesn't conflict with your culture, that's fine and good. But Christianity is our primary identity is in Christ. That's true. And I've actually consciously and subconsciously taken that position for a really, really long time. But then I came to realize that huge portions of my own motivation are actually stemming out of my Chinese upbringing. Like maybe my inborn Chineseness. I don't know quite how that works. And so I realized that I may be wrong about this. I feel like that there are parts of myself that are Chinese and haven't been properly addressed by Christianity, as far, not Christianity. I haven't consciously applied Christianity to those parts of myself. And in order to do that, it's kind of like going to minister to a foreign country, right? You have to understand why are those why it sounds terrible. Why are these people like this? Why are the people that live in these countries? Why do they operate? How do they think? And having lived in this sort of American context for so long, um, I know how the American side of myself works. I pick a banjo. After all, well, maybe not totally. I'm sure one day I'm sure as I continue to introspect, I'll find other interesting Americanisms about myself that are in conflict with Christianity. Um, but I've been trying. I realized, especially because I've been had some interest in. I took notes down. There's parts of me that feel like that almost feel as foundational. Maybe not quite. Like I'm sure I wouldn't like get shot over it necessarily. But there's parts of me that like feel this sort of general filial piety thing. Um, I've often thought, and this is the whole thing. Do people know what filial piety means?
Talk it to
Um,
flesh it out for us.
Okay, okay. Filial piety basically is dedication to the family.
Right.
It's the side of Chinese culture that gives us the impulse to venerate the ancestors.
Yes.
Uh,
Right.
Which is I've often thought to myself that Confucius is from a purely popular reception a much more successful teacher than Plato because there are very few Platonists now, but nearly every Chinese person is a Confucian, whether they know it or not. That may be too great a generalization because obviously it's one of the three teachings, Buddhism and Taoism, but it touches everywhere. It's in the language, just as Taoism's kind of in the language too. But serious, it's really remarkable. Anyways, I mean, it's inside. That's why we bring it up is because I feel it inside of myself. Like I read the Analects a couple of years ago now, and it's not like it's funny because my dad once said, "Oh, we didn't really raise you to be Chinese. We didn't like teach you the Analects. That's why I taught myself the Analects." And it turns out by reading the Analects, I discovered there's a lot of I read it and go, "Oh, that's why we do the things we do. That's why we're the way we are." Um, it's like, oh, okay, this stuff that's now just an assumption for the average Chinese person is once upon a time something that had to be taught, kind of. Confucius will say that he got it from his ancestors, of course.
What's so interesting to me, Caleb, is that in California we have a lot of Korean Christian Reformed churches, and we're just watching this. We're just watching this in real time because many of those Korean Christian Reformed churches are sort of doing what the CRC did earlier. I go to these Korean classes meetings. They're all in Korean. We eat great Korean food, but they've had this enormous struggle with the second generation because and this is happening in the Orthodox Church as well, of course, immigrants come over. This individualism that Mark was talking about is very powerful. And, part of what I'm wrestling with my sermon, I'm really wrestling with my sermon this week because Christianity does something really different. And I'm preaching on Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem. When James the Just, Jesus' brother, basically says, it's really this circumcision thing is really hard on the Gentiles. Let's not do that. Let's just meat sacrifice to idols, strangled animals, and sexual immorality. Because Moses has been taught in all of these cities all over the place. So if they stick to these three things, good enough. And you think, holy cow. And I've just, now with all of the conversations with Jacob and Chezi and Yosef, I hear that and I think, wow. And of course, this is Luke writing this. And then you begin to see the progression in the book of Acts, and you see how that's constructed also in Luke. And this wrestling with, let's say, the Platonic. And then, of course, you have orthodoxy developing, which is this amalgam between Platonism, which on one hand says, like Ron did, Jesus it doesn't matter if there's in Christ, there's no slave nor Greek, no Jew nor Gentile. God, Jesus Christ gives you a new identity, and this just grows like wildfire in cosmopolitan Eastern Empire, where they're all sort of being mixed up in terms of their ethne, and all of their household gods and civic gods are tied to the ethnes, and so on and so forth. And boom, liberation. But then there's the same question of, but then what happens with Christianity is that the first fight in Christianity is the Judaizers who are saying, oh no, that's circumcision. That's really important. You better stick to that. And then the others, but then of course, Christianity gets re-indigenized. And so and we're watching this in America. So we've got the Antiochian Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. And so then, hey, where Methodism comes from? England. You don't get away from any of this stuff.
As I think about what Caleb talked about that God is the author of culture, and that he uses culture and countries as part of his common grace to just prevent us from being as bad as we possibly could. And he loves our culture and wants to redeem our culture. And he probably wants to love us completely as members of a culture. And there is no Greek, there is no Jew, there's no Scythian or barbarian. And so those two things are in tension. I think part of the tension is that our culture is probably partially marked by our sinful nature and total depravity, and God's word is not. But I guess as someone who left the fold and longs for it, I can't go back, and that's okay. But I think God does want to love you as a whole person and as your whole culture. He wants to love and speak to and minister to. So that's my final thought.
Well, like what I was really, thought Mark was hitting the nail on the head just with the whole, yes, like the disastrous qualities of the whole history of evangelicalism, but then at the same time, or what he was, him saying, like, it is still like the infrastructure that actually like works in the world. And so the issue is, how does the evangelical church make use of these other resources? And it's a weird thing. It's like, the evangelical church failed me in many, many ways. But then that is my heritage now. And so it's like, I can't, so like, I'm deeply offended just at the thought of like, I could just go to a different denomination or a different tradition that suits me better. Like, because like that's going against the whole like point of the thing of having a deep multi-generational culture. And then I also think of like, well, maybe there's the young Michael Sartoris in the church there, and if I stay, maybe I can make them find their way through the whole thing a little bit easier. But I think that all those ethnic elements, like, those are all part of the tradition. Like, Stephen, I think of between myself and my wife, like our kids, they have Jewish roots, they have Greek roots, they have German roots, Italian roots, and like all of those different traditions are all a part of their story. But at the same time, there was really important reasons why our grandparents, great grandparents walked away from those traditions and ended up in the evangelical church, because they weren't always functioning the way that everybody looks back with starry eyes at. But if we go back to tradition, it's like, no, people abandoned those traditions pretty quick for a whole lot of reasons. So it's probably better when people go back now, because but they're doing it in the manner of pro-felicity, I guess you could say. So there's some thoughts.
No, that's right. That's right. And I mean, Ron and I lived through, and so did Mark, anybody our age, we lived through the abandoning in the Christian Reformed Church. The tradition of the Christian Reformed Church was intentionally dismantled. It really was. We had the worship wars. I mean, Ron and I both grew up heavy Sabbatarian influences. That was decried as legalism, should be abandoned. You can go, you know, I think, is Russ's still closed on Sundays, Ron?
I'm not sure.
Because
We
he's
would
not
never go
looking
there
for
on
a place
Sunday.
to eat on Sundays. And
How
Jason's-
revolutionary would it be, guys, if Christians stopped going to restaurants after church on Sunday? What I mean, what statement would that make? Both positive and shocking, because it would be a negative. I mean, the restaurant industry would be up in arms, but I mean, I'm starting to wonder if we should go back to that.
Well, I was just watching a video on, you know, Japanese depopulation. And so one of the women who's a leader in that movement, she's recommending Japanese people leave the cities. Japan is urbanized at like a 90% rate. People leave the cities, go back to the village. And I thought, you know, if America really wanted to, because they're just talking about the tyranny of the job, what if we went back to blue laws, which I grew up with in New Jersey? Blue laws were basically stores, restaurants, anything that's non-essential, close it on Sunday. Bring back the Protestant Sabbath. And I mean, the culture would change.
Well, we'd have to voluntarily do it first before we impose it on the wider culture, because Americans are allergic to being told what to do.
Right.